All right, welcome to Maddie's Joy, an Angelman Journey, episode number 2. In today's episode, we are going to visit how this all started. I think how we got started in the Angelman community is a good place to launch the rest of the podcast. So, in today's episode, I know those of you who follow our journey on maddiesjoy.com might think you know the story. Hopefully, I'll add some tidbits in and we will be able to surprise you with a few things. And I hope that you enjoy our story. Welcome to Maddie's Joy, an Angelman Journey. I am your host, Adam Birchmeyer. I just want to say before we get started into today's episode, thank you so much for listening last week. And if you're new to this podcast, welcome. Got some fantastic responses. And one response, Carol, who listened, she noticed that my voice trailed off occasionally. So I'm going to be doing this episode without the pop filter. And hopefully that solves the issue. If not, we'll keep testing. As you can see, it's a new camera angle too. It's just kind of how I do things. I just dive right in. And sometimes you just dive right in, and I'm going to be constantly dialing this in, so be patient with me. But thank you for listening to today's episode. And the topic of today's episode is our story. And I was trying to search all day long and all week long to figure out where I should start. And with Maddie, I think her surprising us, started actually before she was born. So when my wife was pregnant, we did not want to find out the gender of our child. And everything in our gut was telling us that Maddie was going to be a boy. And I remember we were driving across state because we were going to be induced. So we were driving across state to drop our dog off at our mother-in-law's house. And I remember turning to my wife while I was driving and I just said, "We have a boy name picked out." In the 0.1% chance that our child turns out to be a girl, what should we name her? And Madeline popped up. And we wanted some strong family ties with the name. So we visited my grandfather that weekend as well, and we asked for his permission to have Maddie's middle name be Joan. And Joan was the name of my grandmother, who has since passed. But after leaving my grandfather's house, we just went, it's not going to be a girl. We know this is going to be a boy. And fast forward a few days later at, I think it was 1:45, 1:48 in the morning, my wife gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. And they had me announce the gender. And there's so much going on in the room, I actually blanked on the name. So I just said, "Hey, honey, we have a girl." And it was a surprise to us. And my wife made it through delivery without any complications. Maddie was a healthy baby girl. And that's all that we could ask for. And I loved that feeling of being a father and, taking her home and just, she was ours. And if you're a parent, you know that feeling, you know that love. And if you're not a parent and you're listening to this podcast, when people tell you that it's a love that knows no bounds, it's a different love, they're not exaggerating. It's such a special feeling, and we took her home, and this was in June of 2020, so the country was in the midst of the pandemic, early on in the pandemic. Things are crazy, but we had our baby girl. We had a beautiful baby girl, and we spent so much time with her. And I think the next big thing that Maddie had to overcome was COVID. And we're not talking about the COVID strain or strains that are out there right now. We are talking about the original strain of COVID. When my wife went back to work at the hospital, things were starting to get bad here in our part of the country. By the end of October, that's really when our county and our city reached its peak. And Nicole and I made plans, and we tried to be as safe as possible, but with my wife being a nurse, there's only so much that you can do. And it was the first week of November, and my wife started not to feel well. Instantly, we started masking inside her home, and my wife tested positive for COVID. And then a few days later, Maddie spiked a fever. Now, thankfully, Maddie's symptoms at first were pretty mild. She spiked a fever for about 2 days. Her breathing was normal. We monitored at home. Sorry about that. We monitored at home. And, the fever subsided. Everything was going okay until the cough started. And the cough persisted for about 2 weeks, and it wasn't getting any better. So I actually took Maddie into urgent care, and our pediatrician recommended that we take her in, and he said, get a chest x-ray. Find out if it's pneumonia. They did not believe me. Well, they believed me, but they listened to her lungs and they said, oh, you don't want to give her a chest x-ray. She's fine. A couple days later, my wife's home with Maddie, and my wife knows something is wrong. You never doubt a mother's intuition, right? Moms out there, you know your child, you know when something's wrong. And my wife just said, no, I'm taking her back in. And my wife persisted with the doctor on call that our daughter needed an x-ray. Sure enough, our daughter had pneumonia. They diagnosed it as post-COVID pneumonia. And they said, we need to hospitalize her. Now, with my wife being a nurse and the hospital being filled to the brim. They actually, here where we are, opened up an old hospital for COVID overflow. And my wife went, does she need to? So they sent us home. Well, they sent my wife and Maddie home with some strict instructions. And Maddie started to be on the mend. Before Maddie got COVID, she was hitting all of her milestones. After she got COVID, she just laid there. I mean, she was not feeling well. She got pneumonia. Who could blame her? But then the months started to go by. Maddie regressed. She wasn't hitting the milestones that she was prior to COVID. So we were sent to a pediatric physiatrist. This was a little scary. They started physical therapy, they started occupational therapy. And Maddie seemed to be progressing, but she wasn't progressing at the rate they thought that she would. Then it was right around this time that we started to hear about microcephaly. Maddie's head size started to track a little under the curve, and her head size was not tracking as it should. And we're brand new into this pandemic. I mean, we're about a year into the pandemic now. There's reports coming out of the Philippines about children and especially infants getting COVID, and some strange things were going on. So we kind of chalked it up to her having COVID. This was a post-COVID delay, and I was fine with that. I just went, oh yeah, she had COVID, she had pneumonia. I mean, she was sick for a while. So the months started ticking by, and it's about, I would say about July. And our pediatrician, our physiatrist, they're really starting to get worried at this point. Syndromes are starting to be thrown around. This was actually the first time that we heard Angelman syndrome. And then they said, oh, it could be Rett syndrome, because they kind of present clinically the same, especially in infants. And in my head, I'm going, oh no, it's just a post-COVID delay. You guys are I appreciate the concern, but this is still a post-COVID delay. You guys have never seen this. We've never seen this. My child's okay. So about July, they decided to have Maddie get an MRI of her brain and to see a neurologist. The neurologist in our area, the pediatric neurologist, couldn't get Maddie in until December or January. So it was about a 6-month wait to get in to see this pediatric neurologist. Nicole and I were always proactive, so we decided, you know what, let's get the MRI. Let's call the Children's Hospital on the other side of the state. They were able to get us in within 2 weeks. We got the MRI, and then we drove 2.5 hours to this neurologist. And this neurologist looks at the MRI and said the brain structure is perfect. There's a little bit of gray matter, but that gray matter is really still developing at this age, not concerned with it. Me, I'm going, yep, told you my child's fine. But the neurologist suggested we do an EEG and suggested that we go see ophthalmology. That's fine. She was just covering her bases. Everything's okay, and we're trucking along. So we go back and we see the physiatrist, and the physiatrist said, "Well, let's do some genetic testing." And this is October at this point. And we go to get the genetic testing done. They swab our daughter. We go home. Everything's fine. She picks up a little cold, spikes a fever. I'm at work. My wife said, "Hey, it was really strange. When I got Maddie up from her nap, her crib, she had thrown up." "Oh, that's weird. She just doesn't feel well." And I get home and I have Maddie on my lap, and she always had these jerky motions, like her muscles didn't know how to interact with one another. And I have her on my lap, and this is different. She's shaking for a prolonged period. And my wife's in the kitchen. She's making dinner, and I just said, "Honey, you need to come see this." And she walked out into the living room, took one look, and said, "Yep, that's a seizure." So we turn off dinner. We race to the hospital. We get to the hospital, and they're not treating this as serious as we thought it should. And then Maddie has another seizure. So I hit the call light, nobody comes. And then she has another seizure. I hit the call light, nobody comes. Then she has a third seizure. And I popped my head out in the hallway and I said, "Listen, my daughter's having a seizure. Somebody needs to come in here." And the person at the station said, we'll be right there." And then by the time that the ER doctor got in, her seizure had stopped. And he said, "Well, this is still febrile seizures. We gave her a medication. They should calm down here soon." And then he turned, and Maddie had another seizure. So he was in the room. He got to see the seizure taking place, and with my daughter, they were full body seizures. They used to be called grand mal seizures. I'm not quite sure what the medical term is now. But when you say grand mal seizures, everybody can kind of picture what that is. It's a full body seizure, and he timed it on his watch, and he just went, "Something else is going on here." So at midnight that night, we were transported to a children's hospital 40 minutes away. My wife rode in the ambulance. I drove. I walked into the children's hospital at 1 in the morning. And that was the scariest time of Maddie's diagnosis. We were there for 3 days. That first night, Maddie had another seizure in her sleep. There's doctors and nurses coming in and out. We had about 15 to 20 doctors or nurses in the room that first morning. And there's nothing that I can do to help my daughter. That was the worst feeling as a parent. We took Maddie home knowing that genetic testing was still out. And I remember the geneticist, when we were at the genetics office, going, "Well, she has light hair and blue eyes. That's a classic sign of Angelman syndrome. And in the back of my mind, I'm going, she hasn't had a seizure yet. If you look at my dad's family, they're all blonde haired, blue eyed as children. You don't know what you're talking about. And then when she had the seizure, I said, maybe, there might be something to this. But when we got the EEG results back, the technician told us they'll be able to tell by the EEG if this is Angelman syndrome. So if it's not Angelman syndrome, it's probably Rett syndrome or nothing. We read the results. There's no mention of Angelman syndrome. So a few weeks later, we get a call from the genetics office, and the woman on the other end of the phone says, your wife's on this call too. And I just thought, okay, either it's Rett syndrome or it's nothing. But if they're calling, it's nothing. And then she said the news. And I hear my wife on the other end of the phone crying. And the only thing that I can think of is to move my family forward. So I said, what's the next step? I'm in shock. And I think the woman on the phone knew I was in shock. And she said, well, just process this. This is going to be a lifelong journey. And I didn't want to hear that. I wanted to know how to move my family forward. So I reunite with my wife. We go home. And for 2 months, I don't really remember much. I remember a few appointments. But the appointment that really shook me out of my funk was our neurodevelopmental appointment. And the doctor that Maddie had, he sat in the room for an hour. He listened to us. He talked to us. And he gave us some hope. And what he said was, every child deserves to be a part of the community. He told us that every child needs to have a purpose. And he told us that every child deserves to be happy. And those were 3 concrete goals that I could wrap my head around. Those were 3 goals to work towards. And the third one was fine. Maddie's a happy camper most of the time. Don't have to worry about that one. She has loving parents. She has a loving extended family. And love will show through in a child. And love will get her to that happy place. Now the other 2, I had to really rack my brain. And I believe Maddie is a part of a great community. And I don't just mean the Angelman community. The community that we have here in our adopted hometown is fantastic. We're a smaller town, about 30,000 people if I had to guess. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm out in the business community a lot. And I talk about my daughter a lot. A few weeks ago in my networking group, I did a 10-minute presentation on Angelman syndrome and what my daughter goes through. At the end of that presentation, I said, I just want to be an advocate for families of Angelman children and individuals. And I remember Tom in my networking group, he just turned and he said, well, you have a room full of advocates right beside you. My daughter is a part of this community. Now, my daughter's purpose, she's only 2. Hopefully through the website, through Instagram, through Twitter, through this podcast, my daughter's story is influencing others and is spreading awareness. Now, I'm not going to go through everything, the rest. It was really that neurodevelopmental appointment that switched my mindset. And I remember something, and it was really cool. I shared this on Instagram. My daughter goes to a fantastic daycare right now. And they're so patient with her. I never thought that I would get artwork from my daughter. And here I am, picking her up, and I have this fall tree with her handprints on it. And it's the little stuff like that that at the beginning of the diagnosis, I thought would never happen. Don't underestimate this community. Don't underestimate the individuals within this community. There are fantastic advocates out there. There are some fantastic individuals out there. And an Angelman diagnosis, to me, is not a lifelong jail sentence. I always bring up the example that I will never walk my daughter down the aisle. But on the flip side of that, my daughter teaches me life lessons and amazes me each and every single day. And if I had to take one over the other, well, actually, I'm not going to choose that. But just because my worldview is different than how my daughter sees the world, that perspective switch is what I needed. And that perspective switch was the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing now. All right, thank you so much for listening to episode 2 of the Maddie's Joy and Angelman Journey podcast. You can actually find our podcast not only on YouTube, but on Spotify, on Anchor, on Apple Podcasts, and now on Google Podcasts. If you, whatever platform that you are listening on, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Like, share, comment. I wish I had this pulled up. I'll share it next episode, but we actually got a fantastic comment from somebody on Apple Podcasts, and I have to do a little digging because they didn't leave their name. Just thank you. The response last week was fantastic. My goal was to have 40 listens, and at the time of recording this, we are well over 120. Maybe I should stop underestimating everybody, or I should set my expectations higher. But thank you so much for listening. If you have anything that you want me to discuss, anything like that, just please let me know. Send me a message. Whatever idea you want to listen to, just let me know. I know that I deal a lot of times with smaller children because that's kind of my world right now. But I'm going to be bringing on guests that talk about the children in school as well as the adults with Angelman syndrome, because in this community, nobody is going to be left behind. Just a little sneak peek, we have a fantastic guest on the podcast next week. Stay tuned for who that is. But until next time, thank you so much for listening and have a wonderful day.